Hello and welcome everyone. This is your astrology forecast for full moon in Sagittarius, and this full moon is happening on the 31st of May, and this is the second full moon that we have in 1 month, and this is known as blue moon. The term blue moon, I mean, it's like something rare, but it's not that rare. It's more, it just adds psychological depth and tension to it all. And this is Sagittarius energy. So Sagittarius is strongly related to wisdom, knowledge, education, higher meaning, searching for truth, being adventurous, needing freedom, having visions, being able to dream big, to think big, to ask big questions, to explore life. You know, this is the spirit. You know, this is time when we are reminded that the power of spirit is the strongest. And this full moon is also here to remind us that a person can spend half their life collecting knowledge and still remain profoundly lost. And, you know, we can read endlessly, travel endlessly, speak intelligently about spirituality, philosophy, psychology, religion, politics, and still never come into real contact with ourselves. And we all know that, and we have this experience always in our life. And during this time of this full moon, we may have this experience strongly with others. And this can even come through ourselves as well, because this can confront us with our own egocentric behavior, with our own need to show ourselves as knowledgeable, as intelligent, as, you know, the smartest in the room, to prove our point, to be right, and to perhaps abuse the knowledge that we have without really sharing the essence of it, but actually sharing it out of the need to show how smart we are, or how spiritually developed we are, or how superior we are. And if we go into this direction where we are focused on this superior position of who we are, this full moon will really show us our place. You know, it will sit us down or smack us, and we may fail and collapse. So, you know, ancient traditions understood this problem very well. That is why the old initiatory schools were never interested in information alone. Because, you know, information can change the mind temporarily. But, you know, this full moon is about initiation through experience. You know, this is direct experience. This is applied knowledge. And you know, Gemini, because full moon, what is full moon? Full moon is time when we have moon in one sign and the sun in the opposite sign. So this is a time when the sun and the moon are looking at each other. They have a meeting face to face, and they are in opposite signs. So this means that the sun is in the sign of Gemini during this time, because Gemini is opposing Sagittarius, and they are not actually oppositions. They are complementary signs, and together they create a whole. You know, one cannot exist without the other. You know, fire needs air to breathe and to exist. If there's no air, you know, fire dies very soon. So this is what we are learning now. And, you know, Gemini observes, while Sagittarius interprets. And, you know, Geminis move laterally through reality, and Sagittarius tries to rise above it and see the pattern. And Gemini can notice details and facts, but Sagittarius is searching for truth, for meaning, for law, for direction. And, you know, one studies fragments and the other searches for the invisible thread that is, you know, tying those fragments together, that is binding them together. So, you know, too much Gemini and, you know, our mind can become fragmented and overstimulated and restless. And, you know, endlessly curious, but unable to arrive anywhere internally and really, essentially. And too much Sagittarius, and, you know, we begin forcing reality into belief systems that are too rigid to hold to withstand the complexity of life. And this becomes especially dangerous when we stop searching for truth and start searching for certainty. And those are not the same things. The old astrologers associated Sagittarius not only with philosophy and religion, but with divination and prophecy and with sacred law, with long journeys, with transmission of wisdom across generations. And this is the 9th sign of the zodiac, and that matters deeply symbolically, because 9 is the number that stands at the edge of completion before returning again into a new cycle. 9 is a very mystical and powerful number, and it comes after 8, which is the loop of 8, the scorpionic transformation of death and rebirth. And after this comes Sagittarius, the wisdom keeper, the 9th house. So there is life after death. So there is exit out of the loop. We can come out of the loop and we can continue. There is higher meaning. There is wider horizon. There is broader vision of everything. And in many mystical traditions, 9 represents initiation through expansion of consciousness. And this is what the 9th house is about. It's expansion of consciousness. And human birth itself takes place through 9 months in darkness before emergence into visible life. And Sagittarius carries this archetype psychologically. It is the stage where the human being begins asking questions that cannot be answered just through survival. These are not questions that can be answered through the knowledge that we collect in school. This is knowledge that we experience in life. And these are, questions about meaning, about destiny, about the invisible structure that is really behind the existence, and the hidden nature of reality. These kinds of questions. And this is why Sagittarius is deeply related and represented by the Centaur. Not because mythology, wanted some exotic creature, but because the symbol itself describes the human condition perfectly. Half instinct and half aspiration. Half animal, half philosopher. And, one part is tied to appetite, to movement, to, territory, desire, animalistic part. And another part is looking upwards, aiming high with the arrow, and, restless and eager for understanding, trying to reach something beyond this ordinary existence, but also finding extraordinary in the ordinary, and connecting, being, as I always say, we have to realize that we are the horse and the horseman at the same time. And this is the completion, this is wholeness, we are one. So we are not the rider, we are not the horse, we are both. We have to use both our instinct and our mind, our intuition and our logical way of thinking. Gemini and Sagittarius. And the bow and arrow really matter here, because, these ancient symbols were never just there for some decoration. The Centaur doesn't shoot randomly into the world. The arrow is pointed upward and, towards the distance, the distant horizon, towards what has not yet been reached. And Sagittarius consciousness is always oriented towards what lies beyond the current boundary. And the bow and arrow are also one. One cannot exist without the other. What can I do with bow without an arrow? And what can I do with an arrow without the bow? I need both. They are necessary. Both parts are necessary for me to shoot and to hit the target. And it's not so much about hitting the target either. It's about the intention behind pulling the arrow. And we are now learning how to use our capacities, our knowledge, our experiences, how we use our experiences and apply them in real life. And that is why people under strong influence of Sagittarius, they often feel psychologically uncomfortable staying too long inside something that is limiting and conditioning. And it's not that they are incapable of ordinary life, of course, but there is something inside them that suffocates them. If they feel limited, they are breaking free from it. So, Sagittarius part in us wants to explore the world, wants to run away from obligations, from stagnation. Of course, that's the lower part of it, because we are escaping things that are necessary to function in this world. But the higher experience expression of Sagittarius is, of course, to have both, as I said, to embody it all within itself and to keep that flame lit on all the time. The torch bearer, the highest expression, the archetype of Sagittarius is the torch bearer. And, Gemini keeps opening our windows, mental windows in our mind constantly. One idea leads to another, then another, then another, then another. And it's a continuous opening of windows. And Sagittarius eventually gets tired of opening windows and starts asking where the road is actually going. Where is this actually taking me? What's the meaning of it all? And there is a need to see the bigger picture, to rise above and to have an overview. And this changes our perception, it changes our worldview, and it changes our beliefs and our ideals. When we are down in the valley, we see things differently than from when we are on the hill and we are looking down on the valley from the top of the hill. Then we see things completely differently. And it all depends from which angle we are looking into something, because things can seem completely different from one point of view. And we are learning this now. We are learning to honor other people's perspectives without trying to impose our will onto others, without trying to force people to see that my point of view is the only real point of view. So it's really important for us to expand, we expand our consciousness by realizing that there are as many worlds as there are people. There is not one world. There are as many worlds as there are perceptions. And there are millions of perceptions and perspectives. So we are learning now. And some of us may be able to see one and the same thing from many different perspectives. And this can give us a whole new insight about the world we live in. And how easy it is, when we are, for example, we enter into the maze, into the labyrinth, and we don't know the way. But if we are looking into that map of the maze and labyrinth from above, we can see clearly where we have to go, right? So it's really an opportunity for us to rise above and see something that we are struggling with, that we are stuck in, that we can see it and wow, it's so easy. And this kind of energy is very present now, so it can be very powerful for us. And, this full moon may awaken exactly that feeling. And some people will suddenly realize that they have built an entire life around maintenance instead of meaning. They confuse maintenance with meaning. And others may feel an overwhelming need to leave the environment that doesn't allow growth, that prevents our spiritual, psychological, and emotional growth. Some may discover that the beliefs they inherited are, no longer aligned with the person they have become through those experiences that they lived. And, this is very important time because Uranus is in Gemini. And this full moon is opposing sign of the Gemini. This full moon is happening on the 9th degree of Sagittarius, and Uranus is at the 2nd degree of Gemini. So they are not in exact opposition, but the opposition is happening. And there is an opposition between the Moon and Uranus, perhaps, I think, one day prior to this full moon. But it's very strongly felt on the day of the full moon as well. And Uranus in Gemini periods often, are related with massive changes in communication, in transportation, education, media, intellectual paradigms, collective perception of reality, the way we say things, the way we relate to others, the way we connect with others, and but psychologically Uranus in Gemini does something even more intimate. It changes the speed of the mind, it electrifies it, and human beings are not adapting to that speed very gracefully. Ancient people lived under the same stars for thousands of years, same transits, same aspects, round and round, cycles repeating. And, the mythology remained relatively stable. The cosmology remained stable. Person inherited a worldview that usually survived generations. And modern consciousness lives differently. People now encounter more information in one day than older civilizations encountered in years. And this can be seen as madness, but we are adapting to it. And we don't even notice how restless we are, how distracted we are, how unable to be present we are. And yet the human nervous system remains ancient. Our nervous system didn't change, but the amount of information that we receive changed dramatically and drastically. And this is one of the hidden tensions of this full moon. Sagittarius seeks orientation, while Gemini disperses attention in every direction simultaneously. And we may begin reading endlessly, but we don't understand things as deeply as we would usually. We can consume ideas without truly digesting them. We can mistake intellectual stimulation for actual transformation. And this is what we are dealing with. This is what we are confronted with. Intellectual stimulation. We think we are learning, we are growing mentally, but no, we are not. We are just collecting more and more data, and most of that data is unnecessary. And this is, where old traditions become important again, because almost all ancient wisdom schools understood one thing that modern culture constantly forgets: that truth cannot be absorbed at the speed of consumption. And in Gnostic traditions, the problem was never lack of information, and we somehow think that the problem is lack of information, like we need more information and we are digging for information. The problem is actually forgetfulness of origin. The Gnostics believed that human beings carry within themselves a spark of divine intelligence that is trapped inside layers of illusion, of social conditioning, of fear, of false identity, of many different identifications and personal wants and needs. And this is how it is. We are coming back to that knowledge, and whenever we have full moon like this one, we have an opportunity to remember that wisdom, to awaken it, to light that spark that is hidden, that is trapped inside layers and layers of, as I said, illusions and conditionings and fears and false identities. We have an opportunity to light that spark. And salvation is not coming through obedience, but through gnosis. Gnosis is knowledge. And Gnostics are also wisdom keepers, and we have that wisdom within us. And it's trapped. It's trapped under the loads of information. And it's not, it's direct inner recognition. It cannot come through theory. And the Sufis approached this differently, but they arrived somewhere similar. You know, they often described human beings as asleep inside layers of borrowed identity. So we borrow this identity. It's not our real identity. It's not authentic identity. We borrowed it. So like, we are asleep inside layers of borrowed identity. And one Sufi teacher said that the most people spend their entire lives defending conclusions they never truly arrived at themselves. So most of us will recognize this moment where we are defending with our life some beliefs and conclusions that we never ourselves experienced in our life, but that we strongly believe in, because with dogmas, with ideals, with religious views, with fears that trapped us into certain ideals and beliefs. And much of what people call truth is inherited emotionally long before it becomes examined consciously. And family systems, religious systems, political systems, cultural systems, and we often defend these structures because identity has become fused with them. Our identity became completely fused with these structures and systems, and this is why arguments may intensify now, because meaning itself feels threatened. And they may feel threatened, like my truth is threatened, my belief is threatened. So I enter these arguments intensely to defend my belief. And there is that old story. I think most of us know this story, but it's very good to remember it, to remind ourselves of it all the time. And that's the story of a student and teacher. And a student came to teacher to get the lesson about the knowledge, about life. I don't know, I'm paraphrasing it. But the point is that the teacher started pouring the tea in the cup. And he poured the tea endlessly. So the tea started going over the cup. And the tea was spilled all over. And the student said, "Teacher, what are you doing? You are spilling the tea." And he said, "Well, yes, that's the kind of knowledge that you are searching for. You just want information. You just want that kind of knowledge that can never be really integrated. You are you are not going to catch the essence of it. You have to spill that cup and to refill it with fresh experience, and not only to accumulate knowledge. We cannot accumulate. Accumulated knowledge is not wisdom, and this is what most people think with their titles, with their diplomas, with their master degrees. That's not wisdom. That's intellectual, rational, accumulated knowledge, but it's not wisdom. And here we are talking about wisdom. And there is also an old story about a young seeker named Nachiketa. And I think that's the name, Nachiketa. I'm not sure. And he goes to the house of Yama. Yama is the god of death. And Yama offers him everything. He offers him wealth, power, pleasure, long life, status, everything a normal human being desires. Everything that a person can wish for. But he refuses all of it, and he asks only one question: what happens after death? And Yama tries repeatedly to avoid answering because he understands the seriousness of the question. And eventually he teaches the boy that most human beings spend their lives chasing what is pleasant instead of what is true. And this is deeply related to this full moon. This kind of question can take us on a deeper journey with ourselves and with life and with everything around us. Sagittarius in 9th house is also related to foreigners, to faraway places, to traveling, crossing the border, connecting with people from different cultures, different traditions, different languages, different nationalities, different religious point of view, different religions, so that we can expand our worldview, we can expand the way we understand this reality and ourselves. And this is comfort versus truth. And many people under this full moon may begin feeling exactly where they have chosen comfort at the expense of deeper truth. And fire and air work together in very particular ways astrologically. Fire without air eventually dies, as I said. Air without fire remains cold movement without any direction. So Gemini actually feeds Sagittarius mentally, and Sagittarius gives Gemini orientation and direction. And this is why conversations now can become life-changing. One sentence that we hear in the right moment can change our entire perspective during this time. Or a book that we read now can transform whole perception as well. And this journey can begin internally before it begins physically. Someone may suddenly understand why something in them has felt spiritually restless for years. And this is a time when something can come to its fullness. This is full moon. Things come to a head. Things come to their peak. And full moons are always times of culminations, completions, closures, revelations, disclosures, fruitions and fulfillments and the dramas. So something is coming to its fullness. And wisdom usually contains more humility than certainty does. And wisdom without humility is not wisdom, it's arrogance. We have to have humility if we are truly expressing the wisdom and not only accumulated knowledge. And the wisest people are, they often speak very carefully because they understand how enormous reality actually is. They know that perception itself is limited, and they know that human beings interpret the world through memories, through fears, through desires, through longing, through traumas, through imagination. This is how we interpret the world that we see. This is how we interpret our relationships. This is how we interpret situations that we experience. Everything through our own personal filters of our own personal history and memories. And that doesn't mean that truth doesn't exist. It means that human beings approach truth partially. And, like travelers carrying small lamps through a landscape at night. This is like we can see only one part. We cannot see the whole picture. We can see only one part that we can enlighten with that lamp. And maybe consciousness was never meant to possess the whole horizon at once. Maybe it was only meant to keep walking towards it. And to understand that we are all interconnected. Because, when we gather together, we can create the whole that we carry within us. We can remind ourselves of the wholeness that we ourselves have within us, that we cannot grasp all at once through ourselves, but through connection with everything around us. This is how we experience ourselves through experiencing others and through experiencing different cultures, different places, different species, different trees, different people, different skin colors, different perspectives, different childhoods. This is how we meet ourselves as well. We meet the vastness of our existence, of our being. And this second full moon in the same month, it can create strange feelings psychologically. And it's like returning to the same space twice because something there wasn't fully understood the first time. the first full moon in Scorpio earlier in May, at the beginning of May, already pulled a lot of people inward. It exposed emotional truth. It exposed attachments, fears, obsessions, hidden tensions. And now this Sagittarius full moon arrives almost like the next chapter after emotional confrontation. And the mind starts trying to understand what the soul just went through. And we can understand what we've been through. And something big can come out of it. We can give birth to something bigger than us, than our personal story. But we can do it through our personal story. I know it sounds paradoxical, but through our personal story, we can give birth to something much greater than our personal story. And this is how it goes. This is how things happen. And that's a very Sagittarius process, actually. Human beings don't only want experience, they want meaning from experience. After pain, we immediately begin building philosophy around it, right? And after heartbreak, we start asking what love means. We start asking bigger questions. We start searching for meaning. Why did this happen to me? After betrayal, we start questioning trust itself. After suffering, we start searching for God, for spirituality, psychology, destiny, purpose. And that movement towards meaning is deeply Sagittarian. And honestly, that's probably why human beings created religion in the first place. Not because ancient people were naive, but because people can survive difficulty more easily than they can survive meaninglessness. And of course, there is higher power than what we see. And this is what we can all experience now in a different way. Maybe through something very simple. Maybe through a connection with a flower. Maybe through a sound that we hear. There is something that awakens us in some way, that uplifts our spirit, and that shows us the connection of everything. And that shows us that this, what we see here, has a much deeper meaning. And we are just passing by, without noticing the beauty of where we are. And, we just take things for granted. Like we take a walk under the open sky and there's the moon there, but nobody notices it. Like it's normal, it's just the moon. But it's not just the moon. Look how beautiful it is. Let's pay attention to how magical this reality is, how magical we are, how magical this whole experience is, how unique and enchanting every relationship with another person is, how magical it is that we can express ourselves to another person, how magical it is that we can look at each other's eyes and, shake hands and, hug someone. It's all pure magic. But we miss these moments. We take them for granted. And we are blinded by our own beliefs. And as I said, our fears, our own filters, our personal filters. And we miss life all the time. And life is present all the time. Magic is present all the time. So as I always say, we are the magicians. And what kind of magic are we creating? That's the question. And, we can see this throughout history. The harder life becomes, the more intensely people search for some larger pattern behind existence. That's why sometimes these heavy periods in life are necessary, because this is when majority of people turn to something higher. That's why we need these experiences, because then we are reminded of what truly matters. And, some will look towards Christianity, some towards astrology, some towards alchemy or towards Sufism or Gnosticism, or the language changes, but the longing underneath it remains similar. And the Gnostics believed that there is, as I said, that divine spark that is buried inside us, but that we live in a kind of a sleep, in a kind of trance, trapped inside distraction and fear and social conditioning. And the goal wasn't simply obedience, as I said, but awakening. And we have this Uranus in Gemini, awakening through something shocking, through something uncomfortable maybe. And this really, this fits greatly with Sagittarius, because Sagittarius always carries this feeling that there must be something larger behind ordinary life. And even people with strong Sagittarius energy who are not religious usually carry some version of that hunger. They want to understand how things connect. They want to see farther than, just what they see. And a lot of them struggle in environments where life becomes too mechanical, because eventually they start feeling spiritually dehydrated. And this is what we are all experiencing now, because we have this full moon in Sagittarius, and it will affect all of us. And we all have Sagittarius somewhere in our chart, and we all have Gemini somewhere in our chart, and we all have a whole zodiac within us, carrying this beautiful map of consciousness, and this map of all our lives. And just that we cannot see it all at once. It wouldn't be mentally healthy to see it all at once. So we can see only through single lenses. And this is what we are giving. But thanks to this, we can, expand and see the bigger picture as well. And this full moon can bring that realization to the surface. And some of us may suddenly understand that we've been feeding the mind constantly while we were starving for something much deeper, through endless information, endless stimulation, endless scrolling, endless opinions, but very little actual silence where a true thought can fully form. And that's another thing that ancient traditions understood better than modern culture, that wisdom needs some space around it. Fire needs air around it too, otherwise it suffocates. And Sagittarius is a fire sign, but it's very different from Aries fire and Leo fire. Aries fire wants movement, Leo fire wants to express itself, and Sagittarius fire wants horizons, perspectives, freedom. And it's the kind of fire that we carry through darkness when traveling long roads at night. That's that kind of fire. A torch, something that allows us to continue moving through unknown territory. And that symbolism appears everywhere if we start paying attention. The Olympic torch, the hermit carrying a lantern, Prometheus bringing fire to humanity, John the Baptist described as a burning and shining lamp. And even in esoteric Christianity, divine wisdom was often described as flame or a living light. And this is something that changes people once they come close to it. And this kind of light will touch us during this time. And after certain realizations, we cannot fully return to who we were before. When we change our perspective, we can never go back to our previous perspective. And this is what we are moving through now. We are now being transitioned from one perspective to another, and we can never go back to our previous perspective. And this is when our priorities shift. Our relationship with time changes, and certain conversations stop being interesting. Certain ambitions stop feeling meaningful, And a lot of us will experience this during Sagittarius period. And then comes the difficult part, trying to live with what we now know. And that's where wisdom becomes different from knowledge. Knowledge is easy to collect, and wisdom costs something. For wisdom we pay something, usually comfort, sometimes certainty, sometimes identity itself. And that's why older spiritual traditions respected wandering so much. And, pilgrimages, deserts, mountains, long roads, solitude, they understood that when human beings remain inside the same psychological structures too long, this is where perception hardens and we stop seeing life directly and start seeing only through habit. And the desert fathers in early Christianity used to leave cities and go into the wilderness, partly because they believed noise distorts perception. And I'm not saying that we should go into some isolated place. We can do it anywhere. We are living in modern time and we cannot now adapt to something ancient, but we can upgrade ourselves and we can find in the midst of this madness, we can find our torch, we can find our spark, we can find that space where wisdom can grow and express itself in the midst of this madness and noise. And most of us today are never truly alone. We are not even alone internally. There's always something that is entering our consciousness from outside. Music, news, messages, notifications, content, noise, opinions, reactions. The mind never settles long enough to see what's actually there underneath it. And not even when we sleep. And Sagittarius eventually reaches a point where all that noise becomes unbearable. So this is a time when this noise becomes unbearable for many of us. And something inside starts craving direct experience. So we are craving real conversations, real thoughts, real silence, a real distance from constant pressure to react to everything. And that's probably part of why this full moon may feel emotionally and mentally intense at the same time. Uranus near this Gemini side of opposition can speed up our nervous system, and thoughts can move quickly, perspectives can shift quickly, information can come constantly, and Sagittarius tries to gather all of that movement into something coherent. And some of us may feel overwhelmed by how many different truths now exist in the world simultaneously. Politically, spiritually, socially, morally, everyone seems certain and everyone seems convinced. And people have rarely felt this confused collectively. So we may experience collective confusion now. And wisdom usually appears later, after experience has had enough time to settle properly inside of us. And that's why we may now have this experience and need to slow down, because everything will move so quickly that it may seem like it's stuck, like it's standing in place. Everything can move so quickly that it seems like it's stuck, that it can appear as if it's not moving at all, but it is. And we can spend years believing that we fully understand love, truth, morality, spirituality, only for life to completely transform that understanding later. And this is that moment when we may be faced with something that we thought we completely understood, we completely knew, and we may be shocked by what happens. And we stop searching for answers that make us feel superior. We start searching for understanding that makes us more human. This is the key. Because most of us are searching for for answers that make us feel superior. But this is time for us to search for answers that make us more human, not superior, more human. And there's huge difference between these two things. And after enough life experiences, most wise people become simpler. They don't speak that much. Everything changes. They are less theatrical, less interested in sounding profound, and more interested in sincerity and simplicity. And we may encounter some of those people during this time. We may connect with someone who carries that kind of wisdom. And that's probably why some of the deepest teachings sound almost ordinary when we first hear them. And Rumi said, sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment. That's one of the most Sagittarian sentences, and because eventually the search itself becomes more sacred than the need to arrive at final certainty. And maybe this blue moon is trying to bring us back into that kind of relationship with existence, where there is less ideological rigidity and less desperate need to always know and always be right. This is need and thirst for more openness, more direct experience, more willingness to let life continue teaching us. And our souls may suddenly need more air, more space, more freedom to move, to be, to experience life. And we may ask big questions like, what is all of this for? What is all of this for? And this full moon is happening on the 31st of May, as I said, and but this can happen, this can feel very strongly, we can feel this very strongly 5 days before and 5 days later. And this could be a culmination of something that we planted 6 months earlier when we had a new moon in Sagittarius. And this is a time really to connect with ourselves deeply and to understand that there is wisdom in ordinary, and to observe, to be here, to be real, to get in touch with our inner Ken Tower, with that instinctual nature in us and that higher power, to really be strongly on the ground like Ken Towers and to aim higher, to have that arrow aiming higher while we are firmly, strongly on the ground. And with this, I would end this forecast, and I wish us all a very knowledgeable, eye-opening, mind-opening, heart-opening, expanding full moon in Sagittarius, and encounters with simple, wise existences that really are living and breathing in this time and space. I love you all and see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.